Do higher levels of cortisol actually make you gain weight? Kind of. So cortisol is released in response to either a physical or a mental stressor. And its role literally is to increase the amount of fuel in our bloodstream in the form of triglycerides and glucose. And the way that it does this is actually increasing the transcription of specific genes that encode for enzymes that are responsible for taking fuels out of storage and releasing them into the bloodstream. So we have enzymes that will chop up glycogen and release it into the bloodstream as glucose. Some enzymes that will chop up triglycerides and release them into the bloodstream as glycerol and free fatty acids. And triglycerides are how we store fat inside of our fat cells. And finally, it will increase the transcription of enzymes responsible for breaking down protein into amino acids, releasing the amino acids into our bloodstream where they're converted into glucose inside of the liver. And it will also increase the activity of enzymes responsible for actually taking all of this available fuel up into the cells so they can actually use it for energy. And now let's say that this cortisol is elevated in response to a weight training workout. We'll uptake this fuel into the muscles and we'll use it for energy. And even though we might break down a few amino acids after the workout, as long as we're eating our protein, we have elevated protein synthesis and it will rebuild the muscles even larger. So given that we actually recover, we make up for this loss. In this scenario, cortisol contributed to decreasing our body fat, increasing the available fuel we had for our workout, and in the long run, actually increasing the size of our muscles. But now let's say that cortisol is released in response to a mental stress. This could be an assignment that you pushed off to the last minute, or getting really upset at someone cutting you off in traffic. In this scenario, cortisol will do the exact same thing as before, but the problem is that we don't have increased energy demands. So all we can really do with this newly available fuel is redistribute it around the body. But there's a few problems. The first thing is that we actually had a catabolic action on our muscles and turned these amino acids into glucose. And we can't turn them back into amino acids. And since there was no workout signal, there is no increased protein synthesis. So in this case, we're actually at a net loss. So we have all this available fuel inside of the bloodstream, but the brain doesn't really need it, and neither do the muscles. So this fuel will be left floating inside of our bloodstream and eventually turned into body fat. However, one of the big problems is we actually have a very high density of cortisol receptors on what is called visceral fat. And these are fat cells that surround our organs right in the abdominal region. And without getting too deep into the physiology of visceral fat, this is probably the last place that you're going to want to store fat. Most fat is stored subcutaneously, meaning it's in the layer underneath the skin. And this really is the healthiest way for the body to store fat. But visceral fat causes a lot more problems than subcutaneous fat. And unfortunately, elevated cortisol, when we don't actually use the energy that it liberates, seems to increase fuel uptake in visceral fat cells much more than subcutaneous fat cells. So I hope this just kind of demonstrated the two different scenarios where cortisol could be extremely beneficial for our body composition goals or could become detrimental. And while I don't really have too much time left, I will say that one of the best ways to actually reduce cortisol levels really is to engage with something that you truly enjoy. And it doesn't really matter what this is. It could be gardening, playing with your dog, going on a walk, or even sitting down for a good book. But your mind certainly is in control of a lot of your cortisol production.